This lecture is on note taking for beekeepers, and note taking is going to be a really important part of your work as a beekeeper. The notes that you take are going to inform decisions that you make both in the short term and the long term, and the quality of the notes that you maintain are going to enable you to really kind of accelerate your operation as far as being able to identify where your strong colonies are, which colonies are the ones you want to make splits from, and which colonies are the colonies that you want to raise queens from. So without notes to inform those decisions, it's very difficult to decide these types of things in a manner that is both consistent and replicable from year to year. So data is really important. Tracking your hive data is incredibly important for things like health and performance. So the health of your colonies, you want to make sure that you understand when colonies are healthy and when they're not. And although you may not be able to tell when a colony is actually in good health or bad health as far as being a beginning beekeeper, over the course of time, you're going to be able to tell that there are symptoms associated with things like slow buildup or maybe spotty brood patterns. And you want to be able to note those in your notes so that when you come back to that colony, you can see how that health is improving or declining. Things like performance. Some of your colonies are going to be excellent performers. An example would be is I had a colony last year that was a first season nuke with some new genetics that I had not tried out before. And this colony was incredibly productive. On a first year colony, we harvested 150 pounds of honey, which is kind of unusual. And so by being able to track that in our notes, I know exactly what colony that is. And I am, really planning on making splits from that colony and also producing queens from that colony because the genetics are just so good. So understanding that performance and logging that is really important. Maintenance, general maintenance of your colonies. You're going to be coming back and forth from these yards over and over again as you're growing in size. You may start out with colonies at your own home, but over time you may have colonies in another location. And understanding what the regular maintenance is that you're doing on those colonies, things like adding supers or needing equipment, those are things you want to have in your notes. One of the biggest things is that if you're at a yard that's not close to your home, is that you want to make sure that you have all the equipment that you need each time that you come there to do maintenance. And so being able to keep those in notes is really important. If I need 2 supers at a yard that's 20 minutes away from me, the last thing I want to do is miss that when I'm going out there and have to make a double trip. So those types of notes are really important. The actions that you take. So perhaps you added supers, perhaps you maybe added a mite treatment, or maybe you added pollen patty, or maybe you're still liquid feeding. These are actions that you take during the course of the season, and you want to be able to note these things in your notes. Pests and pathogens are huge. Your varroa mite counts are something that you want to log and you want to maintain because you want to understand how those mites build up over time in your apiary. When your hot periods are during the season, they tend to be kind of later in the season is when they get really, really in big numbers. But if you're not managing early in the season, things can go sideways very, very quickly. So I want to make sure that I have those notes in there and that I know what pests are potentially a problem and what those counts are. In addition, you may have things like pathogens. So if you're dealing with something like parasitic mite syndrome and you see symptoms that maybe are leading you to believe that you have some sort of pathogen, you want to be able to note those as well. And all of this data that you collect basically gives you historical perspective. It allows you to be able to understand what is happening in these colonies over time. Now, for those of you that are new to beekeeping, the idea here is that you're not just keeping bees for 1 year. I have many colonies that are 5, 6 years old, and if I didn't have notes to look back upon on those colonies, it'd be very difficult to get any sort of perspective on how this colony has fared over the years. So getting historical perspective is also very valuable from a management perspective. Quality notes. So notes are pretty much like a lot of things that have to do with data. If you put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. So you need to make sure that you have good notes, because really, if you take bad notes, it's a pointless activity. I know folks that will use just a regular, legal pad or something like that to keep notes on about their bee colonies. And for the most part, if you don't have a format and you're just scratching notes down from each visit, coming back to that next season is going to be very difficult to make sense of what's going on there. Now, if you only have 1 or 2 hives, that's not going to be too difficult. But once you get up in numbers, it gets much more difficult to remember, which hive in this apiary out of 10 or 20 hives was that really good hive last year. So you want to make sure that you have good notes. So where do you start? Well, you can make your own template. There's templates on all over the internet that you can use. You can purchase, they have a logbook, they have a lot of printed logbooks that you can purchase just ready to go. And then there's a whole bunch of software out there as well. We'll talk about a couple of those just briefly. So this is an example of notes. This is, when I first started beekeeping, this is one of the ways that that I was keeping notes, was basically by scratching everything on the top cover. And for a couple colonies in California, this worked just fine. We didn't have winters. The ink stayed pretty well, and you could maintain notes here from year to year. But you can see on this top cover here that most of the time these notes are abbreviated. You use all sorts of kind of shortcuts as far as how you're illustrating the health of the hive. You can see right here that it looks like there was a nuke installed here, that there was a too strong of a colony at one point. Looks like we might have been queenless down here, but this is really difficult to make sense of. And if you wanted to look at this from a historical perspective, unless this is kept somewhere else, this is pretty useless. So if you're just keeping a couple colonies, yeah, this may be something you could do, but I don't recommend it. Really, this is mainly, most of what happens during the winter in Michigan, at least, is we get through the winter and most of this ink's going to come off. The tape's going to come off because of the shrinking and swelling over the course of the winter. So, don't waste your time. Consolidate your notes somewhere where you can actually use them over time. So I'm going to give you some of the data points that you want to collect in your notes. And with this lecture is also coming our standard form that we use at MSU. And you're going to see that here in just a couple slides. But some of the important data points that you want to keep as you're putting together your data sheet. First, the date. The date's very important. You want to make sure that you not only include the date, the day of the month, and the year, because you're going to be keeping bees. These bees are going to be living several years, and so at some point you may come back to these notes. You want to make sense of where exactly we were talking about, and so the year is important. The queen status. So we want to know if the colony is queen right. Queen right is basically a condition in which we have a laying queen. She's present and she's laying. Now we can identify this in two ways. One of them can be that we see her directly with our own eyes. The other one is that we see eggs in the colony itself. If we see eggs, we know that the queen has been there within the last 3 days, and we can say that that colony is queen right. On the flip side of this, if you're queenless, you want to note that as well, because you need to get a queen, or you need to observe and make sure that they're rearing a queen. And you also want to make sure, in queenless situations, if you get, in a situation where you've been queenless for quite some time, maybe you get a laying worker situation. That would also be something you would want to note in here. Frames of bees. So the number of frames of bees. Now, this is a rough estimate of the size of your colony. Now, the way that we do this is when you open up a box, before you start digging into it, essentially you count the number of frames that have bees on both sides of them. That gives you a rough estimate of how many bees you have in your colony. Now, we're not trying to count the bees. We're just trying to get an estimate of the number of frames of bees. And the reason that we do this is there are times when you will actually lose bees, and this can inform you as to what's happening. And I'll give you an example. We're coming into swarm season, spring swarm season. And if, for example, you went out to your colony 2 weeks ago and you had a whole ton of capped brood that was just getting hatched, and the colony was wall-to-wall bees, and you went out there and say you had 20 frames of bees when you went out there a couple weeks ago, and now you go out there, 3 weeks later, 2 or 3 weeks later, and you only have 10 frames of bees. And what that could illustrate just by looking at those notes is that maybe you had a swarm that took place, and that would be something that you want to prevent. But in this case, it would at least inform you where all your bees went. And so that's good to know, how many frames of bees. This also is an indication of strength of colonies. So when you look back at your notes and you see you have a colony with 60 frames of bees, that's a robust colony. Mite count. This is a very important thing. You are all going to get sick of me talking about mite counts and the importance of monitoring Varroa mite. So essentially, we have a test that you all will learn in this class, the sugar roll test, which we use to count mites. And essentially, you're going to do those tests every 3 weeks. And so you want to log that mite count in there every time you come and do a visit. And what that informs you is what your mite level is. If we have more than 9 mites per 300, that is our threshold for treatment. Now, if you have a few mites early in the season, it may be an indication that you need to treat as well. but we'll talk about this more in depth when we get to that portion of the class. But mite count is very important to have on there. Disease presence. Do you notice any symptoms that look weird? And a lot of you are not going to be able to identify disease right off the bat, but you'll be able to understand and identify when brood does not look correct. Solid brood frames is what we want. When they start getting really spotty, or you start seeing larvae that are kind of melted down to the bottom of the cell, or sunken caps, or these types of things, these are indications of disease presence, and you can note those symptoms on there. If you don't know what's causing it, this is an opportunity to engage some of your fellow classmates or someone that's maybe your mentor or in a bee club, and help you kind of, you've identified the symptoms, you know exactly what hive it is, you take them out to your yard, and maybe they'll help you out diagnosing that. Actions you take. So like we discussed just earlier, did I do a mite treatment, or did I put pollen on? Am I still on liquid feed? These types of things. Additional notes. So materials for your next visit. Like I said earlier, the last thing you want to do is have a facility or a yard that is, say, a half hour away from you, and you go out there and you forget, oh, well, I forgot from last time 3 weeks ago that I needed to bring out 4 supers with me on this trip. And so you want to make sure that you have the materials that you need for your next visits. And this is a great way to do that, is in a notes section. So this is the template that we use for Heroes to Hives, and I'm just going to cover it briefly here. It's basically got all of the elements that we just talked about. So number one, we've got the hive number. This is an important thing to have. Each of your yards, so you may have 1 yard right now, and you may have 2 hives. Well, you should number those hives because you need to be able to track them. I would recommend numbering on either the top cover or the bottom board. The reason for that is that your boxes will move and shift over time, and sometimes you'll be pulling them off. Sometimes be putting different boxes on, so the numbers will get shuffled if they're on the hive bodies. So I recommend the bottom board or the top cover. But you want to have a hive number, understanding which number that is in that yard. And then you also want, if you have more than 1 yard, you want your yard. So for example, I have a yard in Lansing, I have 1 in Delton, I have 1 in Holt. I need to know which one of these yards I'm talking about and which hive number I am talking about in there. The queen information. So this is where you would put things like, if you purchased a special queen, maybe you have a queen that is a Varroa sensitive hygienic queen, or maybe you have a Purdue ankle biter, or maybe you have a Saskatraz queen, or something like that. So that's where you would write this in. What is the genetic line of your queens? If you don't know the genetic line of your queens, that's not really a big deal. I don't want you all to get hung up on genes right now. This is something that you will definitely learn over time. And it's not something you should be concerned too much with right now, but this is where you would put that information. Maybe other information for those of you who are just getting started that's not so much related to genetic information, but maybe the color that your queen is. If you're marking your queens, we have a standardized coloring system, which you all heard about in the biology of honeybees lecture. And so, for example, if you have a colony that has a marked queen in it, you probably want to know, number one, that the queen is marked, and number two, what color the queen was, so that you know what year that queen is from. Status on May 1st of 2017. So this is a line that we use. Just basically, it's an arbitrary date, May 1st, kind of the beginning of the beekeeping season. It depends on where you're at, in Michigan or across the United States. You kind of have a beginning of the season. Here in mid-Michigan, May 1st is a pretty safe date. By that time, usually we're out of the woods. I mean, we can't have snow through April, but most of the time we're out of the woods by this point. So basically, we want to know, what's the status? Is this an overwintered colony? Is this a new nuke? Is this a new package? What's the status of this colony at this beginning of the season date? All right, so now we have our columns here. The first column that we're looking at is the date that you did your inspection. Like I said earlier, we recommend doing inspections every 3 weeks. It aligns with the life cycle of the honeybee, the worker bee. Every 21 days, we have a new batch of brood that's hatching out. And so by doing regular maintenance and regular inspections every 3 weeks, you're catching that constant brood cycle that's hatching out. What's the queen status on this inspection? Is the colony queen right? Is it queenless and I need to buy a queen? What is the status of that queen? Frames of bees. How many bees do I have in the colony? Counting the number of frames of bees that have bees covering both front and back as you look down into the hive. What is your mite count? What's your mite count is going to be something over 300, or you can write it as a percent as well. Disease, any indications of disease or symptoms of disease. You can write in yes, that we see symptoms of disease, and then maybe you can write down what you're seeing in there as well. Action performed or notes, so what did you do? This is also a spot you can put what you're going to bring next visit for this particular hive. Anything else that you need to go on with that note. It's a good spot for that. Now, what you would do with this at the end of the season is you can compile all this into like an Excel spreadsheet. You can also have template, and this is a template that I'll also send you. This is a template for yard data. So you can look at it from just the individual colony, but if you have yards and you want to look at it more as a yard data collection as well, so this is a little bit more data than what we have on the first template. This is a great thing to have as well. This is the way we have this in my operation is this is the first sheet in our binder, and then we have the subsequent hive, individual hive data sheets behind this. What you can see is you have the yard name. So, this may not be your yard, but where is the yard? And it may be a farm, someone else's farm. So what is also the address of that particular location? Contact information and the phone number for that individual. So maybe it is on a farm, somebody else's farm that you're keeping your bees on. You want to make sure that you have that farmer's information and you have it handy at all times. Maybe you need to know when they're going to spray. Maybe you need to communicate with them when you're going to move bees. Maybe you get stuck while you're out there on the farm and you need someone to come bail you out with a tractor. So it's good to have the farmer's information. The original number of hives at the beginning of the season. So if this is my standard apiaries that we set up, we always stock at 10 hives per apiary. And so that's where I would put this in. The date that we did our inspections at this yard, the number of hives we had at this yard, what actions we took at the yard, what is our next visit action? So what am I going to do at my next visit? This is a good place to put things like, oh, you need to make sure that you bring, mite away quick strips, or you need to make sure you bring, beetle sheets, or you need to bring, things like that, so that you're going to actively treat for something. Next one is next supplies you're going to bring. So what supplies you need? Do I need supers? Do I need more bottom boards? What's going on? Maybe I need to replace a hive body, or maybe I need to replace a top cover, something like that. When is your projected next visit date, and the notes associated with anything you need from this yard. So this kind of summarizes the yard overall. Now, these can get really, really complicated. And this is a hive inspection sheet that I downloaded from the internet. And essentially, this is from a beekeeping club in Central Florida. And this is what they developed for their small scale beekeepers. And it's really meant to kind of lead you through an inspection, but it has a lot of information on here. And for the most part, you really don't need all this information. And I'll kind of, get at some of this. So, they have some of the stuff that we would normally be looking at. They're also looking at hive weight here. So, estimating what your hive weighs, what's the worker population, how's the laying pattern look, are there eggs present, larvae present, cap brood present, is the queen seen, are queen cells, this is a lot of information, although it's good information. And for those of you that are really kind of beginning, this is something that may be able to inform you as you're going through your inspections. However, this is a lot of information, and most of us don't have the patience to fill this out for every single colony. And, even when we get down into things like blooming now, like what are your flowers that are blooming now? This is great information, again, but what's the likelihood that you're going to spend all the time filling this out for every single colony? Well, in the beginning, if you have 1 or 2 hives, yeah, this may be just fine. And this may be what you need when you're to lead you through that inspection process. But for those of you that have, got a little bit of experience, or even those of you that are just beginning, the notes that I showed you previously, those templates, those work perfectly. And as long as you know what you're looking at, and you will know what you're looking at by the end of this class, you'll be all right. You don't need all of this information. Although, like I said, some folks like to have lots of data. This is a lot of information. It's going to take you a while to fill it out. Keeping your hive open for a half hour or 45 minutes while you're trying to fill this out. I like to open my hives, get my work done, and get out of them. I don't generally like to leave them open for long periods of time. And, if you're trying to fill something like this out, you may end up leaving them open for too long. There's a lot of logs out there as well. The Little Giant Beehive log, it's actually the first beehive log I ever used. It's good. The paper's water resistant. It has basic information. You can see pretty much like on this, you're looking at date, hive ID, the number of frames you've got, the number of supers you got, weather, things like that. It's got pretty basic information. If you're going to look for a hive log, I think this is pretty concise and overall gives you kind of the information you're looking at to collect. But again, if you're only doing a couple colonies, this will work fine. If you've got more than that, if you're with 10 colonies, these types of logs get a little bit heavy because you're going to end up having, this is all going to be mixed up unless you have one of these logs for every individual hive, which you can do. But just keep in mind that there are more efficient ways of doing this. And although this is a nice way if you have a couple of hives, when you have more of them, having a kind of a consistent data collection process that is only taking the high level pieces that you need, that's important. All right, so there's also a lot of software out there, and this is just a couple that I grabbed off the internet. This is B-Tight software. I believe this is about $15 a year. So these are pay subscriptions that you have to pay for to keep these apps going. They do have a downloadable app that you can put on your phone, which is kind of nice for being in an apiary. But for the most part, this is I am not really into bringing technology out into the bee yard. Bee yard is messy, it's sticky, and my $1,000 phone is not something that I want to get all infused with propolis and honey and all of that stuff. But some folks can just handle this just fine and really appreciate the ability to be able to log things digitally in the bee yard. It's more of a preference thing than anything. HiveTrax is another one. They've got all sorts of fancy information that you can put in there, like sun exposure. You can actually label every portion of your hive. You will know what this looks like, in your sleep, I hope, by the time you get done with this class. This one's a little more expensive. I want to say this is about $5 a month to keep going. And it's based on the number of hives you have. So if you have 10 or below, it's like $5 a month. You go up, to 20, it's $10 a month. And 20 to 100 is $20 a month. They also have apps available for this as well. So you can pay for it or you can just track it yourself. Sticky fingers are my big concern. We spend a lot of money on these technology devices, and I know in the bee yard, things just get really messy. Your hands are going to be really sticky from all the propolis and wax and all the honey and stuff like that. And so, you can bring these technology devices out there, but keep in mind that this is an apiary. It's not, it's not a computer center or even indoors or anywhere for that matter. You're going to get lots of stuff on this thing. And, if that's all right with you, that's fine. Maybe you're a little more gentle than I am and you don't get a lot of stuff on your tech devices, but it's just something to be mindful of. All right, so you got to choose what method works best for you. There's all these methods out there, and it really comes down to you and what you prefer. So your data is important. You need to keep it organized. That's really important. Like I said, you get garbage in, garbage out when it comes to data. So if your notes are terrible, you're not going to be able to use them on the back end. Compile everything at the end of the season. The winter time is a great time to take all of your notes and compile them and start planning for the next season. Record keeping is going to be really important for things like overwintered colonies. You get those colonies through the winter. You want to be able to look back on the season previously to see how well those colonies were performing. Maybe there's something that you want to take from them, like nukes or splits rather. And maybe you want to wear rear queens from them because you had just a really dynamite performing queen in there. That's information you want to know, and that's where your data is going to come in handy. Dead outs. You can actually look back at your data and kind of help determine why you have a dead out. So for an example, you may have a dead out that occurs early in the season as you're going into winter, before say January, and you look back at your notes and you see that you had high mite loads going into the fall. And I can pretty much guarantee you that those early season dead outs are due to mites, and you would be able to determine that based on your data. For loans, so if you go to Greenstone Farm Credit for a farm loan, they're going to want to see, how your business has been performing. And as a honeybee producer, they're going to want to see, how well have you been able to overwinter hives? What is your survival rate? What are the methods that you're using for management? How well have you scaled up in the last few years? All of that's going to come into play, and you'll be able to glean that information from your notes. For verification, like the Michigan Agriculture Environmental Assurance Program, which is a voluntary verification program for farms to demonstrate that they are using environmentally friendly practices. That verification process, they're going to want to see notes for whatever your farming activity is. And if you're a beekeeper, that is your livestock. And so just like they would want to see your records for, cattle or pigs, they're going to want to see the same thing. So things like, what treatments did you use? Those pesticides that you put into those colonies, whatever those are registered pesticides, and that label on the pesticide is a legally binding document. So you are legally bound to follow those instructions. And as a producer and someone that is applying pesticides, you should keep records of that. And so when you're going through your meat verification, they're not only going to want to know what you've been using and when you've been using it, but also where you're storing it. Where is your pesticide storage on site? So having that information is important. For grants, things like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, they have grants that you can apply for things like cost share on pollinator habitat seed. So if you're going into those processes, well, these federal agencies, they want to see paperwork. They want to see how your farm has been performing. And this is where you're going to be able to demonstrate that, is through your good notes that you took as a beekeeper.